You? On that ridge? We don't need a woman playing hero. The words were loud, smacking the morning like a slap. The crowd laughed. The laughter folded over the firing line and bounced against the corrugated metal of the range like a poor ricochet. She did not look up. She tightened the sling and checked the bolt with the ritual calm of someone who had, for years, conversed with time in tiny, precise increments. Silence is not absence, it is calculation. The general looked over the dais, his gaze slow, and when he met her eyes he did not laugh. He saw the battered stock of the M110. He did not call it that rifle. He called it an M110 the way some men say a saint's name. The faint scar on her right knuckle from a night in Kandahar that no one at the range knew the origin of, and the way she breathed in a measure that kept her heart from announcing itself to the world. The gatekeeper, Captain Lawson, finished with a sneer and a loud rhetorical question aimed at anyone who would listen. How does she expect to keep up with the tempo? She's barely got a uniform that fits. The crowd laughed again. She offered no rebuttal. Her silence was a shape, a curve of concentration, a hollowed place full of practice. But when the general saw her stance, when he watched the almost invisible micro-adjustments in her left hand, a thin pivot of recognition slid across his face. If you believe that competence is louder than arrogance, type silence below. The setting smelled of spent brass and diesel, a military base carved into a scrubby ridge that watched a narrow valley where missions began and sometimes ended. The sun was new, turning the sight lines into slices of gold and shadow. She was intentionally unremarkable in the way that predators are, camouflage that invited underestimation. No swagger, no stunt patches, no telltale medals, only a name patch softened by time. Morgan, she moved like an old metronome, steady, unflashy, necessary. People noticed the details they were taught to notice. The hands were knotted with use, the boots scuffed from long walks in countries whose languages her lips would not shape. They did not notice the years of classified nights. They did not know she carried a service record like a hidden map in her ribcage. Captain Lawson's voice filled the gap left by their ignorance. He was loud because loudness is a mask. Subsume a doubt with volume, and the world will shut up and listen. He told a story about tempo and reflexes and someone who could pull a trigger too slow. The crowd chuckled obligingly. She kept her head down, fiddled with an en-bloc clip as if it were a small choreography. Foreshadowing is not mystical. It is detail left in plain sight. The worn stock, the tiny gouge where a ring had once struck plastic. These were not vanity marks. They were signatures of a life that had already written itself in small, exact strokes. The training exercise started as a setup and then became a crucible. A convoy in the valley below radioed a dead vehicle, an overturned MRAP with a pinned team, and a wounded gunner calling in coordinates that jittered like a frightened bird. The range would pivot into real-world tempo. An emergency extraction simulation turned real when a nearby insurgent cell took interest. The gatekeeper barked orders, assumed roles, assigned the unit a perimeter, and assumed she would take a rear position. He did not know the weight of her quiet. Her preparation was a ritual built of pauses and measured motions. She checked the M110 again. Iron sights, optics, the gentle click of the safety that meant health, not threat. She set her cheek against the stock and let the ridge teach her the valley. An action of professional calm moved through her like a tide. She spoke only twice. Ready and cover. The words were the smallest possible currency to spend on a battlefield. Her hands were steady when the convoy's voice cut out, and the scream of a hydraulic line bent silver in the sun. The crew needed an advantage. Eyes from above. The exact placement of a round that would disable a fuel line and stop a cascade of explosions. She had been an observer. Now she became intervention. The irony tasted sweet. The man who had mocked her for tempo had built into his own arrogance an assumption about tempo he could not see. She adjusted her breathing. She placed her index finger beside the trigger like a promise. When she squeezed, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The shot left the barrel as if it had been waiting for permission. It sang across the open space and found a thin target, a hinge, a pin. So specific a layman would call it luck and a professional would call it precision. The vehicle shuddered where the round met its mark. The fuel transferred, the ignition stalled, The fire that would have consumed men was denied a starting place by a hole the size of professional intent. The aftermath was deafening in its quiet. People looked for noise to measure consequence. They waited for fireworks and got a single, surgical punctuation mark. The gatekeeper's expression collapsed first. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as if words were inadequate scaffolding for what had happened. Around him, the crowd dissolved into a chorus of disbelieving questions and the low, reverent whistle that marks the immediate conversion from doubt to awe. She exhaled and did the motion that betrayed nothing yet said everything. She cleared a spent casing with the efficiency of a habit, not a gesture. There was a pause that spread like cold. The general walked down from the dais. The silence the gunshot had left was no vacuum. It was a space where history rearranged itself and assumptions found themselves out of place. The captain attempted to reclaim narrative with sarcasm, a flurry of rhetorical darts meant to pin the moment to his version of events. "Lucky shot," he said loudly, the words thin and brittle. "Coincidence." He kept talking because the mind that judges loudly rarely knows how to accept being wrong. The crowd wanted a villain to enforce order, and he obliged by making the story about him. But the general stopped him with a look, an authoritative pause that served as a hinge. The validator's approach was not theatrical. He moved like someone who had seen too many moments escalate into legend to waste breath on dramatics. He asked one quiet question to which the answer would be a ledger. "Have we got our file here?" The clerk produced a thin folder like a confession. The reveal was staccato, each item an exclamation. Unit: Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Deployments: 6. Combat hours: thousands. Medals: Bronze Star with Valor, Navy Cross citation pending. Missions: classified Tier 1. The information landed like artillery and reshaped the mental map of every person within earshot. The captain's mouth fell into a shape that apologies eventually would crawl through, but not yet. The general's hands, calloused and stern, lifted in a gesture that meant more than a mere acknowledgement. He offered a salute that belonged to another time, full, formal, immediate. The room inhaled its own astonishment. Respect is born of recognition. The captain had assumed the opposite and now tasted the bitter aftertaste of that error. The validator's voice carried the weight of institutions that do not bend lightly. "This is Sergeant Morgan," he said, and the rank prefaced her identity with an institutional gravity that stripped the captain of his smug authority. He spoke with the finality of a gavel, reciting qualifications not to impress, but to correct the ledger of assumption. The crowd listened as if learning to read again. He described the nights she had spent zeroing in under moonless skies, the missions where she climbed where others refused, the time she bore consequences in silence because the work did not require applause. Each clause was an incision through prejudice. The irony cut clear. The man's loudness could not manufacture competence. The woman's quiet competence had been there all along, waiting to be accounted for. The captain sputtered. He tried another jibe, a question about tempo and the strain of sustained operations. The validator answered with a detail only someone who had walked the same corridors of decision could produce. Her last rotation logged 92 consecutive hours on Overwatch without a lapse. She calls cadence where others call tired. The point was not to humiliate the captain with malice, but to recalibrate a community that had learned to measure worth by volume. The captain's arrogance felt small now, like a bone in a child's fist. The ripple extended outward. By evening there were messages in the guards' quarters and quiet conversations by the chow line. By midnight, the story had seeped into online forums where veterans annotate legend with technical notes and a special kind of reverence. Morgan's shot became a line of conversation in message boards where timing, wind, and ballistic coefficients were debated until the small hours. The legend-making process is simple: a precise action, a witness with credibility, and enough restraint from the protagonist that others can project meaning onto it. She did not seek fame. She let the truth circulate, clean and unadorned, and it grew because truth has a stubborn way of demanding attention. The captain's humiliation turned into reflection rather than performative recantation. He apologized within the week, not because of a coerced mandate, but because he had seen with his own eyes what humility looks like: small, honest, and accompanied by a straight gaze. He sought counsel in a way that absence of ego can create. He asked her to show him something instead of asking to be forgiven. She agreed. They shared a morning on the line where she taught him how to read light across a valley, how to find tempo in silence. The humility was not theatrical, it was pedagogical. He learned, and in learning, he repaid the world for his earlier arrogance. The base began to commemorate the event in small, dignified ways. A photograph, grainy, taken by someone who'd been there and who later wished they had framed it better, was pinned to the message board. It showed a ridge and a shadow and a rifle that looked like any other if you only saw the metal. If you looked closer, you could see the gouge in the stock, the detail the general had noticed, and the set of shoulders that made the silhouette unmistakable. Someone scrawled, in hurried black marker, Morgan Line, and the handwriting stuck like a talisman. The name traveled from the board to a foxhole, to a morning briefing, to a coffee cup where it sat as a quiet reminder. Her philosophy spread with it. Competence is quiet. Respect is earned and given as a consequence, not granted out of comfort. New recruits read the chalked note and imagine themselves in that space where action annihilates assumption. The captain changed more than posture. He changed policy in small things, adding checks that required competence rather than charm. The wider community adopted the story as a lesson plan. In interviews and quick debriefs, they started asking recruits what they would do with silence. The protagonist, Morgan, deflected every flourish. She taught others the technical, how to account for drift, how to read breath as a metronome, how to find a calm that makes all other noise irrelevant. She did so not as a marquee instructor, but as a mentor in the small, daily ways that forge professional temper. Months later, the valley was quieter in a different way. The threat that had jutted up like a bad year had been blunted, partly because of new measures inspired by a shot on a ridge, and partly because of people who had learned to value competence over applause. The myth grew into practice. Briefings where the first slide is assumptions. New soldiers are taught that the measure of a teammate is what they do when no one is looking. Morgan's name became shorthand for a principle: respect earned by action. The captain, now less loud and more measured, would sometimes tell recruits, with that awkward humility of a man who has swallowed pride, "Listen, watch. You might learn a thing," he would mean it. The general, who had offered a formal salute that day, admitted later in private that he had been the kind of man who once judged by appearances until an event compelled him to read the ledger of a life. His salute had not been theater. It had been a correcting of scales. Morgan continued to work without fanfare. When called upon, she answered with the smallest possible phrases, ready, clear, and the world rearranged itself around the competence of her choices. Legend feeds on retelling, but it survives on practice. The ridge remained named in memory if not on maps, and a small plaque in the squadron house carried the words that mattered most. Precision is quiet. Years passed like a logbook full of entries that mean nothing to strangers and everything to those who keep watch. Some nights, she would sit at the edge of the ridge and let wind pull at her hair, counting nothing but the steady beat of a heart that had seen both loss and redemption. Veterans came and went. Stories were recited on long transports, and recruits grew into roles defined less by rhetoric and more by measured skill. The tale of the shot migrated into instruction manuals, into lectures, into the raw grammar of institutional folklore. If you can measure it, you can teach it, Morgan mentored quietly. She did not take credit, but she did not refuse to correct, to demonstrate, to make young hands learn the right pressure to put on a trigger. Her legacy was palpable in the way new marksmen adjusted their posture when someone said, "Find your Morgan." It was not a command to mimic. It was an invitation to embody a principle. The captain, whose conversation once filled rooms, learned instead to listen, an adjustment that made him more effective. He traded swagger for accuracy in decisions, and, more importantly, gained the respect that comes from being a better steward of the people under his command. The validator salute became a story told in formal rooms as a lesson on institutional humility. The world is uneven and full of false assumptions. Sometimes it takes a single act of quiet competence to make the ledger balance. The narrator holds the last beat like an offering. The valley taught them all something durable, that loudness is fragile and competence is durable, That fool's bravado cannot stand in the face of meticulous, practiced skill. Morgan's hands, those hands that had steadied more than a rifle, continued to guide others with an economy of words and action that felt mythic because it was practical. The photograph on the board faded at the edges, and the plaque collected hands' fingerprints. New recruits touched the plaque the way children touch carved names at graves, with both reverence and a recognition that a story asks something of you. In training rooms and on quiet ridges at dawn, instructors told the story not to exalt Morgan, but to set a bar, demonstrate, don't declaim. The moral was not a moralistic string. It was a professional instruction. The captain learned to deliver orders without the need for theatrical seasoning. The general, older, found more ways to listen to the quiet reports that often meant more than loud briefings. Morgan remained unmoved by fame. Her satisfaction came in small corrections observed in others, a younger marksman who set equipment with the same ritual care, a leader who learned to ask rather than assume. The world had shifted, respect was being recalibrated toward merit. If you find yourself at a crossroads, believing that appearance or volume defines worth, remember the ridge, the hole in the fuel line, the single precise shot that stopped a fire. Remember the small, unremarked details, the gouge in the stock, the scarred knuckle, the way she said ready, like an immovable fact. The story ends not with fireworks, but with quiet instruction. Competence is shown, it does not shout. True legacy is not the loudest voice at the table, but the echo of a measured action that reshapes a community's rulebook. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud spectacle and where disciplined restraint defines worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories. The morning after the plaque was pinned, the ridge smelled of damp earth and spent metal. A thin mist clung to the grass, making the world look like it had been painted in muted grays. Morgan's boots left faint impressions along the path she habitually walked, the route that ran from the small cluster of barracks to the training slope where the targets were set. She kept to routine the way others kept to prayer, an unvarying cadence that steadied her mind. It was easier and safer to live in procedures than in praise. As she passed the plaque, she paused a breath and let her fingers hover over the carved name without touching it. She did not seek comfort from remembrance. She gathered it, the way a marksman gathers breath before a shot. The plaque had shifted the conversation in ways that required quiet tending. New recruits walked past it with the awkwardness of children in a museum, curious, respectful, unsure how to translate the reverence into their own actions. Some lingered and read the weathered caption aloud, the words breaking the morning silence, for demonstration of precision under pressure. Exemplary steadiness. Quiet professionalism, the captain had added a line, smaller and more personal. Teach what you know. Demand what matters. He'd put that last line there as a challenge, more to himself than to anyone else. Morgan's presence on the ridge was an unannounced curriculum. She never declared, never staged. She corrected knots under a recruit's harness without a lecture, demonstrating the right tension with hands both quick and patient. She showed how to listen to an engine's idiosyncratic cough and how to smell fuel that held a hairline fracture in its line. She placed a palm over a stock, feeling for the mole of wood that had been gouged by a foreign splinter years ago, and used its familiarity to teach proper cheek weld. These were small rituals, and each one carried a larger lesson. Precision is an accumulation of small, correct choices. "How long?" asked a young corporal one afternoon, watching her shorten a paracord with practiced parsimony. "Does it take to be like you?" Morgan didn't answer immediately. She tied off the end with a neat, almost ceremonial finish, then said, "Long enough to notice the small things." The corporal frowned. "You mean practice?" "You mean notice," Morgan said. "Practice without observation creates habits. Observation without practice creates pride. The two together make something useful." Her voice was flat, the words given like facts. He nodded, as if he had expected more flourish, then found himself altering the way he checked his gear, the way his hands traced the metal and leather, an unconscious adoption of posture. That was Morgan's work, not to be loved or admired, but to be imitated where it mattered. Yet the presence of the captain, still rattled after that morning in the supply yard, complicated the ridge's new atmosphere. He oscillated between contrition and performance, and both made him a visible study in human unreliability. He had come to Morgan with a folder of training indexes and a contrite mouth. "Morgan," he'd said, avoiding her eyes, look. I've authorized time off, extra drills. I want to make sure your method goes into the curriculum." Morgan accepted the paper without comment, arranging it into her satchel in the way someone accepts a tool. He cleared his throat and asked again, Are you going to stay? Will you make this part off normal training?" Her shoulders lifted in a tiny gesture of indifference that carried the same gravity as a verdict. "I teach when asked," she said. "I don't make doctrine." He swallowed. "You're making it anyway. Do it well, then," she replied. "Make it so that it can be repeated by someone who isn't standing here now. Make your instructions simple and checkable. Make allowances for fatigue and for people who rush because they think hurry is a virtue." His face hardened, as if he'd drafted a rebuttal, then softened. "I've been loud. I'll work on it." Loudness had a way of coming back, like a persistent cough. Over the next weeks, the barracks hummed with the friction between habit and discipline. New arrivals arrived with reheated arrogance, a swagger they had learned in other places, bars, social media feeds, flight schools where bravado had once earned them a quick promotion. They tested the ridge's quiet gravity like it was a shore, and they were sharks. Morgan watched them come, and she watched them go. Some lasted. Some left with a strangled sense of entitlement, bruised and gone. More interesting were the ones who stayed. A civilian contractor with hands like a carpenter's and a tendency to fill silence with cleverness found himself taking apart and reassembling an M210 until the rhythm of the rifle pulsed like a metronome in his chest. An older sergeant, who had seen too many changes to believe in profits, began to sit and watch drills without interrupting. He would make a point, rare and precisely timed, to ask a question that exposed a false assumption. Morgan answered with a short, useful sentence, and the sergeant would nod and take notes in a hand that was steady because it had been forced into steadiness by necessity. The ripple effect moved beyond technique. The base's social architecture softened in ways that weren't explicit. Where there had been competition for visibility, who could speak loudest in the briefing room, who could dominate the lineup, there was now a subtle restructuring. People competed less to occupy space and more to fulfill roles effectively. Performance metrics shifted. It's harder to measure humility, so they created new assessments. The captain worked with the logistics officer to formalize a simple checklist. Maintenance protocols revised, pre-progress checks added to the roster, and a mandatory observation period for newly promoted supervisors during which they were required to sit and listen rather than speak. Morgan had nothing to do with the policy, yet it carried her fingerprints because it mirrored what she'd done on the ridge. Insist that observation precedes decision. In the background, the public's interest grew in a way that made the barracks staff wary. A story about the quiet professional who humbled a braggart in the supply yard had begun its slow creep through civilian feeds and forums. It was the sort of narrative that gets mined and reshaped by strangers who know nothing of context. Some pieces were adoring, rendering Morgan into a myth with a dramatic tagline. Others were suspicious, suggesting the entire event had been staged as PR. Morgan had no taste for fame, and the attention made the captain even more nervous. He wanted to control the story. He believed narrative could be folded into training tools, but stories resisted control. They belonged to those who told them and those who needed them. One afternoon, after a week of watching recruits practice dry-fire routines until their shoulders ached, Morgan received an unexpected visitor, the validator. He did not announce himself with the old seniority that came with rank. He arrived in plain clothes and walked with a measured, easy step that suggested a man comfortable on both parade ground and front line. The general's entry into the barracks folded silence into ceremony. People straightened in their chairs, not out of fear but out of instinctive habit, standing for something larger than embarrassment. He looked older up close. The years had dug canyons into his face, and his eyes held a patience that had been earned by time, not assumed. "Morning," he said to Morgan, voice low and exact as a ruler. He moved his cap in a small, formal gesture before tucking it under his arm. He did not ask for introductions. He'd seen the file, not in the public registry, those he already had, but in a closed annex, a list of names that only the few were permitted to view. The general had come to see what the younger soldiers had not yet allowed themselves to notice, that competence often wears ordinary clothing. "Sir," Morgan replied, the single word a rope thrown across a chasm. It landed, no tautness, no frayed edge. "You didn't have to come," the general said, watching the recruits who were lining up in squads. "I could have called you in." "I came because I wanted to see how they practiced," she said. "There's a difference." He smiled, a small quick thing. "There always is." He listened for a long moment to the quiet, sounds of boots shifting, the metallic clack of magazine releases, a distant faint crash where someone had dropped a crate. He asked a question that was at once casual and precise. "Do you think they'll remember what we taught them?" "I don't know," Morgan said. "I know what they can remember if they have to." "That's a good answer," he said approvingly. "Better than most." He glanced at the plaque, then back at Morgan. "I read the report," he said. "The official one." He tapped a thin folder against his palm. The old way of touching paper in a world that still carried paper as evidence of decisions. They suggested awards, media releases. They wanted to frame it. Morgan's hands were empty, as they often were. "Framing narrows things," she said. "It fits them into a picture. People become props." The general chuckled, an almost inaudible thing. "You don't like props." "I don't like myths that get in the way of learning," she replied. He considered that. "We both know how stories work," he said. "They simplify. They inspire. They mislead at the same time." He looked at her, and for a moment his expression held the soft frost of a man about to make a concession nobody expected. "But some stories are necessary." "Necessary for whom?" "For the ones who have never seen it done properly," he said. "For the ones who only ever heard it described and never watched a hand steady a sight." "It's not about you." "It's rarely about me," Morgan said. "It's about the work that comes after someone notices." "Then let it be the work," the general said. He folded his hands behind his back and studied the recruits. "Teach me something then. Show me what you see in a prone lineup." Morgan set herself beside the first rifle, shoulder angled in a way she'd learned in a different desert, perhaps a different war. The general watched as if he were reading a map. She adjusted the bipod, the slight tension of the sling, the natural curl of a finger around the trigger guard. The details were small and numerous, like grains on a lens. When she settled, her breathing found a rhythm that matched the mortar of a drum, steady, continuous. The general watched her hands, the arc of her gaze, the way her cheek met the stock. He saw the scar that jagged her knuckle, and in that small thing he recognized a history, not mythic feats, but practical scars that mark sustained use. "Watch the muzzle," Morgan said softly, and when she fired the first shot, it was an affirmation rather than a question. The recoil settled into her shoulder, and the rifle returned to the place it had been before. The second shot arrived like punctuation, and then the third. Each one was clean and true, boring a hole into a paper target until it found the black. The general didn't clap. He didn't need to. He had watched too many displays to be swayed by performance. He watched for pattern. When she finished, he looked at the target, at the cluster of holes that showed a slow grammar of skill. He reached out and touched the paper, gentle as if he were reading a relic. "That's not accidental," he said. "It wasn't meant to be," Morgan answered. He turned to the assembled recruits and staff, people who had gathered out of curiosity, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the morning air. "What you just saw isn't a dramatic moment isolated like an explosion in a film," he said. "It's evidence of iterative competence. It is boring practice elevated to effect. We make too much of spectacle and too little of method." The captain, always anxious to translate words into orders, took that as permission to formalize more training. He began drafting a class, a rigorous observation rotation included, and he asked Morgan to help design it. She refused at first. She didn't want to institutionalize her presence. But the general, in that quiet way he had, made an argument that appealed to her pragmatic instincts. Do it not as an honor, not as a celebration, but as a necessary exercise. If you can teach them how to notice and how to check, then they will do better. The rest will follow. Morgan consented, on the condition that the curriculum would be straightforward and replicable. She insisted on checklists, on mandatory observation hours, on fault injection, deliberate small errors that trainees had to find and correct. "If you can spot what is wrong without being told it's wrong," she said, "you've learned something durable." They designed the course over the following month with the same economy Morgan demanded. It had modules that bore the unromantic titles: Equipment Habits, Observation Protocol, Error Seeking, Rhythm and Breath. There were no dramatic names, no promise of instant greatness. The language was intentionally prosaic. The captain liked the plainness. It calmed him. The general approved by writing a single annotation in the margins of the syllabus: Reward the act, not the announcement. The new program began with skepticism baked into its audience. Men and women who'd been lauded in video clips and newsletters depended on applause. To them, silence felt like indifference. The first week was either going to reveal gullible fools or harden a new breed of professionals. Morgan did not speak much in the classroom. She let mistakes be made and observed who corrected them. When she did interject, the statements were short and expository. The stock moves, she'd say. You adjust the sling. The shot misses less. A young lieutenant named Ramos resisted the program with a kind of gallantry that had the edges of arrogance. He'd been a viral sensation, one of those brief, bright flames whose fame had flickered over a semester and then left a residue of entitlement. He questioned components not out of curiosity, but out of a need to dominate the conversation. Why not just shoot more? He asked on the third day, hands spread in the performative way of someone used to being the center. Morgan looked at him slowly, her face giving nothing away. You would waste more ammunition, she said. You would teach yourself that volume equals success. It doesn't. Ramos bristled. So what's the point? We're not in a slow-motion film. Moments are fast. You need speed. You need accuracy, she replied. We measure speed by how quickly you can reliably put rounds where they belong. That is not the same thing. The classroom fell into a hush. There was a bunched energy, some sort of forced breathing, then a thin applause from someone who'd lived long enough to view patience as a virtue. Ramos fumed, but his hands worked. He found himself staying after class, alone with a rifle, and there was a small change in the way his shoulders settled. It was almost imperceptible, an adjustment of center, but to Morgan it was a note of music. She didn't praise him when she saw it. She simply tightened the sling on his rifle and said, Again. Again. He echoed, less a challenge and more a command to a part of himself that wanted to be better. Outside the classroom windows the valley began to color, lamplight and sky. The recruits filed out with faces that had moved from incomprehension to a kind of numb learning. The plaque on the ridge caught the dying light, and for a second the carved letters read like a lesson. Morgan walked back toward the plaque then, not to touch it, but to let its presence be a companion. She passed the place where the captain had fumbled his apology, where the general had listened, and where a young man had been silenced into concentration. Her presence there was less a monument and more a marker of an ongoing task, to hold a standard in a world that loved to trade standards for applause. That night, in a small mess hall lit by bare bulbs and the soft hum of conversations, recruits compared notes. Someone had started an online thread about the course, attempting to archive small tips and errors like badges. They debated the general's speech, the captain's new policies, and the stubbornness of a woman who refused to be mythologized. A civilian technician posted a photo of a target with a cluster of holes and joked, "Is this sorcery, or is this just practice?" Others answered with earnestness, "It's habit." It's boredom made sharp. Morgan ate alone at an unassuming table, nursing a cup of coffee grown cold. She listened to their voices like one watches traffic, noticing the rhythm, the accents, the dangerous cuts that edged toward crash. A young recruit sat across from her, cheeks still flushed from exertion. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever get tired of being quiet?" She looked up, coffee cradled in both hands in a gesture that was older than him. "No," she said. "Silence isn't the absence of thought. It's the room where thought can happen." He smiled, not fully comprehending. "But don't you want others to know? What you did in the supply yard. People talk about it like it's a myth." "It becomes a myth when people forget the small parts," she replied. "When they don't know the steps that made it possible. Then it's a story that begs for explanation rather than action." He nodded slowly. "So you keep showing it. Over and over. Until Pleto it." "Yes," she said. "Until they do it." In the weeks that followed, the course took on a life of its own in ways that were both predictable and surprising. Some trainees rose to the expectations and became instructors themselves. their competence humming quietly through the ranks. Others left, not because they couldn't meet the standard, but because the work of noticing and correcting was too unglamorous for their temperament. The captain found small, awkward ways to celebrate the students' progress, but he did so without spectacle, just an extra ration of commendation in the watchbook, a quiet word in someone's file. The general stopped by more often, not to praise but to observe and to correct policy where it had drifted toward ceremony. Rumors persisted beyond the base. The mythmakers couldn't resist polishing the edges of the story. They wanted the climactic shot to be miraculous, the supply yard exchange to have been staged with cinematic timing. Those frameworks were useful entertainment, but useless for teaching. Morgan cared less for the rumor than for the recruits who had learned how to notice a drag on a bolt or the minute wobble of a sight. She cared about the steady accumulation of competence, the daily unremarked corrections that made later miracles unnecessary. Even so, echoes of the supply yard confrontation found new venues. A visiting training officer from another base, loud, younger, and recently promoted, scoffed at the whole idea of quiet professionalism. He staged a challenge in the courtyard, not malicious necessarily, but performative. He called for a timed reposition drill with extra cameras and observers, intent on proving that speed could be engineered into spectacle. Morgan watched from the edge of the courtyard, hands folded behind her back. The drills began with fanfare, with a micro-audience and a soundtrack of bravado. Men and women moved quickly, certain they had the right answer. Rifles snapped through positions. Gear was thrown on and off in a flurry of motion. At first glance, everything looked impressive. The visiting officer grinned, the crowd cheered. Then the target data was read. Misses were more common than the applause suggested. A couple of rounds clipped the outer ring. A few hit the berm inadvertently. The visiting officer's smile thinned. He blamed the equipment, then the crew, then the weather. Morgan walked up to the data board, touched the printouts, and let her eyes trace the pattern of errors. She could see, in the scatter, the signature of haste, inconsistent cheek welds, improper trigger reset, a misadjusted parallax. She didn't announce this to the crowd. She said to the officer, quietly, "You move fast because you think fast. Speed without check is more costly." His pride flared. "So what's your point?" "Find the smallest thing that stops you," she said. "Fix that. Repeat. The rest will follow." He paused, then asked, "How long does that take?" "Depends on what you value," she said. That answer landed like a pebble in a pond. The visiting officer's face hardened, not from being bested in argument, but from recognizing that the real question had been asked. What did he value? The crowd, too, felt the shift as if someone had dimmed the periphery lights. They had come for spectacle and found themselves face to face with a principle. The visiting officer didn't withdraw gracefully. He fought in the narrow ways that irritated most men of his type. He made technical objections, demanded a session in private, tried to turn the conversation into a critique of the course's relevancy. Morgan met each barbed line with a single, composed sentence. When he insisted on a public rematch, she consented but set conditions. They would run a small set of tests under controlled variation, low light, unexpected mechanical failure, a simulated casualty. He accepted with the certainty of someone who confuses acceptance for understanding. On the day of the rematch, the wind had picked up, carrying an edge that bent flags and hair. The crowd assembled under the season's cool tone, the visitors expecting fireworks. Morgan moved through the prep with the general calm of someone who had practiced this choreography without the need for display. When the event began, the visiting officer's team hit speed but not consistency. The errors accumulated like a pattern in a forensic report. Then Morgan's turn came. A single shot to verify sight alignment. A cadence measured not by a stopwatch but by breath. The volunteers with simulated casualties performed their roles badly on purpose, wobbled hands, overdramatic moans, and the team adapted because they had rehearsed for the unexpected. When the targets were tallied, the visiting officer's team had a respectable time but a scatter of hits. Morgan's grouping was close and centered. The officer's face, which had started the morning as an armor of arrogance, cracked in the particular way men show when they must reconcile one clear fact with a dozen noisy beliefs. He walked away muttering about luck. Some of the younger audience members applauded anyway, because they were drawn to victory narratives. Others watched with a dawning comprehension that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. That night, in the marketplace beyond the base gate, storytellers began to shape the new set of episodes into the broader lore. The tale of the rematch carried a different color than the original. It spoke not only of a single humiliation, but of a refutation of spectacle as a method. Social feeds splintered into debates, some claiming that Morgan's win was proof that training beats talent, others arguing that natural ability cannot be taught. Morgan herself paid no mind to the arguments, focusing instead on details, which recruits had adapted to varying stressors, who had learned to whisper-check a bolt when the simulator failed, who had kept their cool. As her presence continued to ripple outward, a new subplot developed among the trainees, one that Morgan had not anticipated. Two recruits, each from different backgrounds and with different skills, began to form a bond that looked suspiciously like mentorship. Lena, a former paramedic with quick hands and a slower temper, found in the class a chance to apply triage discipline to weapons work. She approached problems like she had approached patients, methodical, compassionate, profoundly practical. Across from her, Eli, a young mechanic with a scabbed hand and a laugh that arrived late, discovered that his inclination for tinkering could be shaped into preventive maintenance rather than improvisational fixes. Morgan noticed them early, how Lena would pause before passing a wrench, and how Eli would watch the way she folded her fingers as she tightened a screw. One evening, as twilight hugged the ridge, Lena and Eli stayed on the line. They shared a thermos and a packet of sardines, the kind of hands-on, plain dinner that leaves oil on the fingers and a residue of practicality on the breath. They spoke quietly, less of heroics and more of habits. "You ever think about why we do this?" Eli asked, turning a small screwdriver between his knuckles. "Because we can make something better," Lena replied. She didn't romanticize. She offered a practical phrase. "Because small changes make big differences when everything else is wrong." Eli nodded. "Morgan says to notice first." "She said it most days," Lena said. "Then she shows it." "I like the showing part." Eli laughed softly. "I like the not showing. It makes the showing valuable." They worked in companionable silence, punctuated by occasional observations, like the way a worn bolt could be detected by the subtle shift in torque, or how the scent of overcooked wiring could forewarn a short. Morgan watched them from a distance, thinking of the ways competence multiplies when the right habits are shared. That multiplication, she understood, was the true prize, a community that built resilience without needing drama. Outside the base, the world continued to want theatrics. The media wanted sound bites. Some bureaucrats wanted policies that translated into press releases. Morgan's quiet, rule-based approach irritated both. Yet beneath the surface, something larger began to anchor, a practical consensus that repetition, checked by observation, yields a kind of truth. That consensus would not make headlines as often as conflict footage or flare-laden videos, but it would save lives and mission hours in a way that glitter cannot measure. And so the ridge endured, a place where small rituals accreted into a durable culture. The plaque breathed a small permanence into the otherwise shifting daily life. Yet the real monument was the way people began to move, slower at first, then with assuredness, carrying the lesson forward not as a story to be told, but as a habit to be practiced. The captain kept the checklists in his office, sometimes leafing through them like an anxious man glancing at the weather before a flight. The general dropped in from time to time and rarely spoke, which is the truest sign of approval. One does not pontificate at a machine that is running well. The story of the supply yard had transformed into a curriculum, into evenings of practice, into the soft resetting of priorities. Morgan remained a presence at the center, quiet and deliberate. She did not seek notice. She did not desire it. The satisfaction she cultivated was small and precise, like a well-cleaned chamber or a properly seated round. She watched the recruits learn to find the smallest things that could destroy them and to fix them before disaster needed a hero. This was her work. She chronicled it in nothing more than the steady beat of corrected mistakes and the occasional polite nod when someone demonstrated a hard-earned competence. Night fell on the base like a curtain, and the ridge fell into its easy dark. The plaque gleamed briefly by the lamplight down the path, then subsided into shadow. Inside the barracks, Someone hummed an off-key song that drifted into the rooms like a leftover warmth. In the quiet of her quarters, Morgan laid out her gear with the same care she taught. Her hands moved with a memory that was more muscle than mind, rotary motions that became grammar. When she set the rifle beneath the rack, she paused and placed her palm over the stock where the gouge marked the years of use. She did not speak the name aloud. Memory, she had learned, is more useful when it is kept as instruction rather than ornament. Outside, a new recruit checked his sling for the third time before sleep, a small private ritual. He'd learned to notice the faint drag in a cable that could change the path of a mission. He smiled, small and private, because in the dark he felt the comfort of knowing that tomorrow he would not be surprised. That, more than any headline or plaque, was the real measure of success. It was the way competence spread, not by trophies or speeches, but by quiet, unassumingly practiced improvements that gathered into a new standard. The valley slept, and with it the base, two bodies breathing in the same rhythm. In the places where light remained, people practiced the rituals Morgan had given them, nodding, checking, slow breath cycles before trigger tests, the ritual reshaping of a checklist into a habit. The captain, in his office, stayed late to translate the day's lessons into notes for the morning. The general, in his quarters, read the new training logs and found himself less interested in press and more in the notes of small corrections. And Morgan, empty-handed but full of method, prepared for another day, because the work did not end with a single perfect shot, nor with a plaque on a ridge. It continued, in patient repetition, in the absence of fanfare. She had been the spark that set the shape of a culture, but she was not its keeper, the recruits were. And so, in the deep fold between midnight and dawn, the ridge held its breath and taught itself anew. The story would continue to be told and retold with varying fidelity, but the kernel of it, the insistence that competence is shown, not broadcast, took root in the quiet places where people actually live and work. The ripple of that quiet would widen in ways neither Morgan nor the general could fully measure. In time, the captain, once loud and hurried, would find himself checking a knot twice before giving an order, feeling the steadiness of a ritual he'd once dismissed. The plaque would grow more fingerprints, the photograph would age, and both would be carried forward by hands that had learned to honor the small things. The night deepened. In the next hour, a radio would squeal with a call about a training exercise. A blip on a screen would reveal a maintenance alert, and a young voice would say, "Ready," with the flatness of someone who has practiced readiness until it becomes the only language of trust. Morgan would answer with the single word she used for so much, "Understood."